Welcome, everyone, to the second panel of the Carnegie Global Dialogue Series for 2021 and 2022. My name is Paul Hanley, and I'm the director of Carnegie Center in Beijing. I'm glad to be joined today by colleagues and friends, Alexander Gabuev, Guan Guihai, and Jennifer Brick Murdazvashvili to discuss the future of the China-Russia partnership. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our Carnegie Global Dialogue Series, this is our 10th year hosting this series. It is a series of panel discussions examining China's evolving foreign policy and international role from the perspective of Carnegie scholars and experts at each of our global centers across the globe. You'll be able to find replays of this dialogue and all of our previous Carnegie Global Dialogues on the Carnegie Endowment's China in the World podcast. Our China in the World podcast has been up and running since 2013. We have well over 150 episodes. And in the podcast, I host a series of discussions with Chinese and international experts on Chinese foreign policy issues, China's international role, and everything else involving China's relations in the world. So I encourage you to check it out. Turning to today's discussion, I'm delighted to introduce Alexander Gabuev, Guan Guihai, and Jennifer Murdazvashvili. Alexander Gabuev, I'm going to call Sasha from this point forward, if that's okay. Sasha is a senior fellow and the chair of the Russia in the Asia-Pacific program at the Carnegie Moscow Center. Sasha is a frequent participant in our Carnegie Global Dialogue series, and we're glad to have him join us again this year. We're looking forward to hosting him again in Beijing in person soon. His research focuses on Russia's policy toward East and Southeast Asia, political, ideological trends in China, and China's relations with its neighbors, including those in Central Asia, which we'll talk about today. Prior to joining Carnegie, Sasha was a member of the editorial board of Kommersant Publishing House, and he also served as deputy editor-in-chief of Kommersant Vlast, one of Russia's most influential news weeklies. He's previously worked as a non-resident visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and he's taught courses on China energy policy, Chinese politics, and Sino-Russian relations at Moscow State University and at Fudan in China. Thank you, Sasha, for joining us. Dr. Guan Guihai is the executive vice president of the Institute of International and Strategic Studies at Peking University or Beijing University. We've been fortunate also to have Dr. Guan as our past contributor, participant in our previous Carnegie Global Dialogue series, including last May and back in 2017 as well. Dr. Guan specializes in Sino-Russian relations, Russian diplomacy, as well as socio-political development in Central Asian countries. In addition to his vice president role at Beida, Dr. Guan also serves as the director of the Center for Modern Russian Studies, and he is an advisor to the Chinese Ministry of Education on Sino-Russia issues. Dr. Guan earned his PhD from Moscow State Institute of International Relations, and his bachelor and master's degrees from Beijing University. Delighted to have you back, Dr. Guan. And last but not least, Dr. Jennifer Brick Murdazvashvili. Jennifer is a non-resident scholar in the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment. She's also the founding director of the Center for Governance and Markets and an associate professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research focuses on issues of governance, security, political economy in Central and South Asia and the former Soviet Union. Jennifer is the author of Informal Order and the State in Afghanistan, which received the Best Book Award in Social Sciences by Central Eurasian Studies Society. And she has a second book coming out, Land, the State, and War, Property Institutions and Political Order in Afghanistan, forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for joining us today. Before we kick off, I'll go through very quickly a couple housekeeping items. First, we want to make sure that the audience has an opportunity to ask questions. And so during our discussion today. I'll kick off with a number of questions, but if you would like to submit a question from the audience, use the chat function on YouTube, and we'll try our best to get to your questions. So with that, let's go ahead and kick things right off. Today's topic of discussion focuses on the future of the China-Russia partnership and its implications for Central Asia, for the United States. In the past year, a cooperation between China and Russia has grown across a number of domains: security, technology, economics, global governance. In the security domain, the China-Russia partnership appears to grow increasingly stronger. This October, the two countries held their 10th annual maritime interaction naval drills, and in August of this year held joint military drills with over 10,000 service members in Inner Mongolia. In the economic field, rising energy prices continue to highlight the complementary aspect or nature of the China-Russian economies. On technology, the two sides have deepened their collaboration on space and civilian nuclear power technology. And on global governance, the two countries continue to converge in their prioritization of the UN Security Council as the centerpiece of the international system, and more recently, their joint opposition to the upcoming Summit for Democracy held later this week. That being said, the China-Russian relationship has also been tested by the two sides' competing priorities in regions like Central Asia, and also their differing approach to relations with third parties such as Europe and the United States. And so to bring more clarity to all of this and the trajectory and implications of the China-Russia partnership, we're glad to have our three experts today. My first question, really to lay a foundation for our discussion, I would like to give each of you an opportunity to offer your assessment of the current state of China-Russia strategic partnership. As I mentioned, we've seen a number of domains where China and Russia have strengthened and expanded their cooperation, but there also appears to be areas where cracks in the relationship may be emerging, such as those relating to the Belt and Road in Central Asia. And so let me start, if I could, with Jennifer, and then move to Sasha for Sasha's views on how this looks from Moscow. And lastly, to Dr. Guan to talk about his perspectives. He's coming in to us, of course, from Beijing. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Jennifer.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you so much for the opportunity to share these thoughts. This is a really important question right now, especially, given my work, I focus on Central Asia and Afghanistan, and watching the relationship between China and Russia evolve has been one of the most interesting things of the past several years. And quite important for the future stability, I think, of Afghanistan. And it is one of those areas where we really do see strong cooperation between Russia and China. Although there are some cracks, I think, that we should watch out for, and I'll talk about those in a second. But this is one area where China, Russia, and I would even argue that the United States actually share very strong mutual interests in the future stability of Afghanistan. What China and Russia have shared over the past several years is, I think, a deep frustration with the performance of the US government, the US military in Afghanistan, especially watching over the past several years, the security situation in Afghanistan deteriorated significantly. This was of extraordinary interest to Russia, which has long considered Central Asia sort of this, as we all know, this buffer zone, its own sphere of influence. As the security situation really deteriorated in northern Afghanistan, I think many in Moscow were asking whether Afghanistan would be better off without a US military presence. This is really a change from, positions that Russia had taken for many years, which was quite supportive of the U.S. military intervention. And I would argue that the same was true for China, which was looking at what was going on in Afghanistan, very concerned about internal dynamics in Afghanistan spilling over. Of course, the Uyghur issue is one that is of enormous concern to China. And looking at this instability in the North in particular as being inherently destabilizing. And so with the removal of the United States, all of these countries, Russia and China, began negotiations with the Taliban, began dialogues with the Taliban before the US withdrawal. And I think that there was a hope that the Taliban could impose some kind of order in the region, and especially in the North, the area that they were most concerned about. And that seems to have happened, right? So with the withdrawal of the United States, we suddenly see quiet. We see a very tenuous lack of conflict. I wouldn't call it peace. We're not necessarily hearing about large-scale insurgency against the Taliban, but it is very, very early. I think it's very early for us to say the Taliban really also seemed quite surprised by the fact that they came to power so quickly. So what does this also mean for Central Asia? So Russia and China obviously have historically had a very strong division of labor over Central Asia that sort of emerged quite organically, that Russia really took the lead on security issues and China was increasingly taking the lead on economic issues. And China's economic investment through Belt and Road and other initiatives has really changed the landscape of Central Asia, especially in the past 10 years. But what we're seeing now is an evolution of this. We're seeing China become much more active in the security realm with the establishment of security of military bases in Tajikistan in particular. And this has really changed China's historical role in Central Asia, which is that of more of an economic interlocutor than one that is involved in military. So there is this cooperation between the two. They both share strong interests in maintaining the stability. Another thing we should bear in mind is that the Central Asian countries in particular have been able to play Russia and China off against one another, I think, quite skillfully. So we don't see one homogenous policy coming from all countries, that they all have specific interests with Russia, specific interests with China. And this gives these small countries actually greater leverage over the future of their relationships. Rather than being subjects to Moscow or subjects to Beijing, we see them really expressing a lot of autonomy and sovereignty. So that I think is two issues. The sovereignty issue in particular is one that Central Asian countries are quite sensitive about. And I'll just wrap things up with one sort of comment and question. This cooperation looks all well and good, but this doesn't take into account Pakistan and India. And we know that China and Russia do have very different approaches to those two countries, but Pakistan and India are very central to future peace in Afghanistan. So I'd love to have a discussion about that later and hear from our other panelists on that issue.
Jennifer, thank you very much. That's a great contribution to kick us off, focusing on interests of both countries, China and Russia, in Afghanistan, some of the changes that we've seen over the years in terms of their views of the US presence, and of course, where we are today. Also focusing on Central Asia, which I know will be a key topic of our discussion for the next hour. And, on that, of course, and we'll dig into this a little bit more, you mentioned that there had been a sort of a division of labor that is evolving here. And so I want to pull on the strings a little bit on that as we go forward. And then Pakistan, India, also different approaches from both China and Russia, and we can come back to some of that. Sasha, if you could, touch on some of those issues, but also just step back and across the sort of, across the gamut of domains, looking at the China-Russian relationship. In the past Carnegie Global Dialogues, you've given a good description of where China and Russia converge nicely, but also where there may be some areas of divergence. How are you seeing that now, and has it changed since the last time we held our Carnegie Global Dialogue where you participated?
I think that all the time I use the trope of like three pillars the stability along the border, the mutual economic complementarity, and the similarity between the political regimes that are not very similar, but are definitely not democracy, in the United States. And I think that all of these three pillars are relevant. They're here to stay, and they provide a lot of stability to the relationship. And also the economic pillar in particular deserves a lot of exploration and is a guarantee that this relationship will continue to grow. I'll give you one example. This year, because of growth in commodity prices, we have an increase in trade by roughly 30 billion US. The year is not over, but last year, despite the pandemic, we had a trade of 105 billion US. This year, we're clearly set to surpass 130 billion mark and probably arrive at somewhere around 140, depending on the price of oil. And it's not only the prices for commodities, but also the volumes. Russia really tapped into the opportunity to ship more coal to China amid the energy crisis. And Russian companies are really busy to explore all of the new openings in the Chinese market. Yes, there is quarantine. There are very strict limitations on which goods you can transport on railroads. There are quarantine in ports, but nevertheless, this part of the relationship is definitely there to expand. And then on mutual support of the two authoritarian regimes, I think that what's the most important is that both are not allergic. When they talk to each other, why would Xi Jinping bother about poisoning of Alexei Navalny? Why would Vladimir Putin bother about Xinjiang or Shanghai? And I think that's providing a stabilizing climate in the relationship that's not there when Xi Jinping is talking to Joe Biden or Vladimir Putin is talking to Joe Biden. On top of that, so these three pillars are here to stay. On top of that comes very problematic relationship that both powers have with the United States. Despite the efforts of President Biden to stabilize relationship with Russia, provide some guardrails, this July summit between the two leaders, we don't see any huge material improvement in the relationship, although there are multiple channels of communication. Our former boss, Bill Burns, came to Moscow recently, but nevertheless, we see Russian troops massing on Ukrainian border. The presidents are about to talk in roughly 40 minutes, and that's a really crucial dialogue. But the long-standing issues will not go away between Russia and the United States, even if today's call is successful and both parties avert major conflict in Ukraine. Same most likely goes for China and the US relationship. Despite the recent phone call between President Biden and Chairman Xi Jinping, the relationship is in a trajectory for more competition, conflict, and management of the conflict will not remove all the long-standing issue. That brings Russia and China in the same camp, and they have huge number of areas where they can cooperate to strengthen each other in this competition and to undermine US primacy, both in Asia Pacific and sometimes in Europe. There is work on resilience against US sanctions. There are shared interests in Northeast Asia. All of these patrols and military drills are there to signal something to the US. So I think that this is very likely to stay. And I also totally share Jen's assessment on Russia and China managing to find a good formula for Central Asia. Yes, there is competition for influence, but I think that the number of interests that actually overlap far outweighs the competitive element in the relationship. And we hear a lot of analysts saying that if Russia and China are to clash, this is really about Central Asia, because that's the region in between. That's where both Moscow and Beijing want to exert their primacy. And hey, I think that both Moscow and Beijing have been very skillful in managing this relationship and adapting to each other, changing posture and needs. I think that Russia is now okay with growing Chinese footprint in Central Asian economies. It can do nothing about it. it's structural. If you are any of the stance, where do you go with your commodities except for China? And I think that Russia is also understands Chinese need to provide security for its interests in Bahad corridor. And perhaps Tajikistan is the only place in Central Asia for now where China can have military outposts of that type. That being said, final point, I think that there are some points on frictures and rupture, particularly Russia is clear cut that its confrontation with the US is here to stay. Its reliance on China will grow. And this relationship is increasingly asymmetric, where Russia needs China more than the other way around. So what happens 10, 15 years down the road? How dependent will Russia be on China? And whether this leverage that China will have will be exploited by Beijing to force Moscow to do something that the Kremlin wouldn't do under normal circumstances is now being more frequently discussed in Moscow. And we see some pushback against some projects, particularly reliance on China in civilian technology like 5G, coming from the Russian counterintelligence community, which is, I think, increasingly vocal in voicing its concerns about this deepening dependency on China in some of the critical areas. I'll stop here.
Sasha, thank you very much. And I appreciate you starting out with the natural areas that bring Russia and China together in terms of the stability along the border, both sides, looking for some stability, and they have that, want to maintain that, the economic complementary aspects, similar regimes, as you said, not democracy. These are things that naturally bring China and Russia closer. But then when you add the US element, the complications with the United States that both Russia and China have, that in a sense serves a function of bringing China and Russia even closer together, one could say. Central Asia, you think the two sides can, at the end of the day, figure it out. It's not as bad as people like to make it out, is what I hear you saying. And your last point about, this asymmetric dimension is worth watching, that over time, this could be something that puts some strains on the relationship. And there is some concerns growing in Russia about this. And you mentioned in particular the Russian CI community, which is quite interesting. Dr. Guan, do you have a similar view from Beijing? Do you see in a similar way those natural areas that bring Russia and China together? How does the US dynamic impact that? And what, if any, concerns do you have about the relationship in terms of the long-term trajectory? Over to you in Beijing.
Thank you, Paul. Generally, I agree with two colleagues' view about the current status of relationship of China and Russia. Of course, in China today, we are valuing our relationship with Russia much more than years before. It's normal because we feel more and more pressure from the United States. And for us, Russia is most important partner in almost every area for Chinese security and development. As first. The second one, we from Chinese side are seriously concerned about the importance of Russian role in Central Asia. I'm very confusing. Every time when I was in the United States in DC, or American friend always ask me, how do you think the crash or conflict between Russia and China in Central Asia? I also always answer to them, it's not true, because China has very crucial attitude toward the interaction with Russia in the Central Asia region. As Sasha mentioned, we are adopting to each other's influence in the region. So I'm sure we can find more suitable way of coexistence in the region. About the political side of our relationship, as you know, President Vladimir Putin and our Chairman Xi, they have unlimited trust, unlimited wide scale of scope of the interaction. I mean, for Chinese leader, it's unbelievable to be at the opening ceremony for Winter Olympics in Sochi. Also, we were not possible to see any foreign president in China during the pandemic. But I think President Putin will join our opening ceremony in Beijing. Even our United States friend doesn't want, do not want to join, but our Russian friend wanted to join to share our happiness. In China today, we call our relationship with Russia unlimited. No border. We can talk about any issue, and we can think about any way of cooperation. If we are unable to do that today, but maybe we can do that tomorrow. So it is quite unusual relationship between great power in our world. So as my habit, I would criticize my object of research, but towards Russia, I can say nothing bad because in China it's a very serious consequence you should have. So, Paul, when we talk about Russia to each other in Beijing during our lunch, I can say everything, but right now I cannot say about that. Lastly, I want to say United States make very special policy towards China and Russia. Even from Chinese side, we always tend to show United States side, we are not Russia, we are different, but finally, you did China job.
Say that last part again. Can you say that last part again? Finally, what?
Finally, United States make China and Russia almost the same country. I mean, in the foreign affairs field.
Thank you very much. So what I take from your comments, as you kicked off, you value the Russian relationship with Russia more than before, and you said right at the top, in large part because of the pressure we're feeling from the United States, and so that those strained relations between U.S. and China do, in your view, have an impact again on bringing China and Russia closer. Again, just like Sasha, you think the issues in Central Asia can be handled You have a very cordial attitude toward Russia and Central Asia adopting to each other in the region. That it's seen very favorably that President Putin will attend the opening ceremony of the Olympics in February. And of course, that's against the backdrop of an announcement today that the United States government will conduct a diplomatic boycott of the Olympics in February. You can't say anything bad about Russia over this virtual session. You could if we were having a lunch, but you don't seem to have any problem saying negative things about the United States. That's okay, Dr. Guan. I have thick skin and I can take it. I'm just kidding. We are getting a lot of questions, and I want to turn, I think Sasha raised this issue of the two presidents meeting here in about 30 minutes now at the top of the hour. And Sasha mentioned the troops massing on the Russian border with Ukraine. I can tell from the questions coming in, this is of huge interest. And so I think we owe it to our listeners just to pull that back a little bit. It's caught the attention of a lot of folks. It's been reported in the United States, intelligence found evidence the Kremlin could be planning an offensive into eastern Ukraine as early as next year, with a force potentially up to, I've heard, 175,000 troops. The Biden administration has already announced that Russia would suffer significant and severe economic harm, sanctions like we haven't seen before if Russia goes ahead and invades Ukraine. President Putin and Biden are meeting here over video conference in the next 30 minutes. And these developments, obviously have the potential to really inflame tensions between Russia, the US, Europe as well, and could lead obviously to some sort of an international crisis. So I want to start with Sasha, who raised the issue. Help us understand the context here from your standpoint. What do you assess President Putin is trying to do here? Why is he mobilizing forces now? Do you expect the situation to get much more tense? And what would it take to ratchet down hostilities? This is sort of a conglomeration of the questions that are coming in, and I'll turn to Sasha first, and then I'll turn to Jennifer and Dr. Guan. Sasha?
I'm very sorry, Paul, but because I work from home, I've forgotten my crystal ball that looks directly into Vladimir Putin's mind in the office. Unfortunately, it's somewhere parked near Dmitry Trenin's desk. But jokes aside,
okay, you've got a good track record of prediction, so we'll take.
Well, I think that everybody who claims that he knows what Vladimir Putin is up to should be a little bit more humble. Our former boss, Bill Burns, was recently speaking at Wall Street Journal conference, and he said that what the US intelligence community observes is something that we read in the news and something that we can track in the open sources. Like there is a massive inflow of Russian troops from different parts of the country. Most of them have been relocated there in the previous months. And these are basically new positions because before 2014, Russia has never viewed Ukraine as a potential adversary. Now it has to. And so there is this gradual multi-year effort to create a huge combat force that would be ready to be deployed if a crisis emerges in or around Ukraine. So that's part of it. But definitely there is a lot of signaling. What Vladimir Putin is up to, is it a preparation for a military offensive? Is it just a signaling to call US attention? We don't know for sure. What we know for sure is that the Kremlin recently is signaling very harshly. Vladimir Putin has written a lengthy article. Dmitry Medvedev, his deputy at the National Security Council, has written an article signaling changing Russian approach to the red lines. And if before no NATO membership for Ukraine was the red line, now deeper engagement between Ukraine and NATO, use of Ukrainian territory for training, and particularly military sales of weapons like Javelin, anti-tank missiles, is seen as a red line. And Vladimir Putin wants to talk. And he wants to talk not to Kiev, but to Washington, D.C., because he believes that the United States have tremendous power over government in Kiev and can force Kiev to do something to meet Russian requirements. I think that's the framework we should look at. If Joe Biden says, no, Mr. Putin, Ukraine is a sovereign country, you don't have a power to you don't have a veto power over Ukraine's sovereign choices, and we don't want to take your security concerns seriously, I think we might be in trouble. But we'll see what happens. I think that the July meeting has given us some hope that there is this desire to avert military hostilities, and that President Biden, although he has all of these tools of economic coercion, also prioritizes diplomacy. And diplomacy means not appeasement, but sitting down, talking very clearly the red lines and trying to find compromise. And I think that Team Biden is equipped with a lot of former colleagues, high seasoned professionals that know Russia well and hopefully can find a solution. So we'll see what happens there. Very final point here. I think that we saw China-Russia relationship benefiting from annexation of Crimea and Russia's rift with the West emerging in 2014. That was the start for Russia's pivot to China, and we see a lot of mutual projects materializing after 2014 and driven by Russia's conflict with the West. I think that if there is a new conflict here, and hopefully we can avert military hostilities, but definitely it will not go unnoticed, probably Russia-China ties are to become even stronger. There will be downsides if crushing sanctions are imposed, like kicking Russia out of SWIFT or blacklisting Russian banks and energy companies will have dramatic impact on China's interactions with Russia too. But definitely Russia will look at China as one of the potential lifelines to support its economy. And Russia's reliance on China will only increase as a result.
Thank you, Sasha. You focused a lot in your answer on the importance of diplomacy between the US and Russia in this particular context. It is interesting to note, as a China watcher, looking at US-China relations, that President Biden did try to get diplomacy kicked off with Russia earlier than China. Of course, President Biden and President Putin met at the Geneva conference in June, well before President Biden did his virtual meeting with President Xi, of course. But the meeting between Biden and Putin set off a series of high-level diplomatic engagements between the US and Russia. 3 trips to Moscow since July by senior officials of the Biden administration, additional meetings in Finland and Switzerland. So there has been some diplomacy, and considering where we started, that I think is important to note, but it'll be important here at this meeting and onward, as you suggest. Jennifer, let me turn to you, because I'm interested also in your perspectives, how you see the situation. I know you don't have a crystal ball either. None of us do, but what's your sense of what the Russian leadership is trying to achieve, and how do you assess the effectiveness of so far of the US and the European response? I think you're on mute. Sorry.
It's an early time. I think this is, we clearly see this, I think, as Putin trying to frame his relationship, I think, with the United States. So obviously, a lot of this has to do with longer term strategic interests with regard to NATO. And I think this was, a bit surprising given the perception of many that the US sort of capitulated to Putin with regards to Nord Stream and some of the energy agreements that happened. And there were, quite a few people in Washington quite upset with that. So if we were to have a crystal ball, really hard to say what this all means, except that we know that this is directed at NATO. Right. I mean, that this longer term, broader strategic issue, and that's sort of how I would examine this issue. But if we look at this, I want to take this back to something I could speak more authoritatively on, which is how this relates to core issues in Central Eurasia, that these countries are looking at this quite askance, frankly. This is not good. Russia's interference, I think, in Ukraine is not looked quite favorably upon by countries in Central Asia. None of them have recognized Russian annexation of Crimea. That is, while China and Russia may, achieve mutual benefit, if their objective is to, increase their influence over Central Asia, this kind of maneuver doesn't help them at all, because countries in the region still perceive Russia as the primary security threat. And I want to be clear about that, right? We talk about the Taliban, we talk about spillovers from Afghanistan, and this is what Russia cares about. But if you're a Central Asian country and you have seen instability throughout the former Soviet Union, you often see Russia's hands involved in that. And so they, I think, are very concerned about this kind of meddling inside of Ukraine, because sovereignty is very, very important to them. So the optics of Russia doing this are not very good. But I should say that, in response to this, increased cooperation between Russia and China in Central Asia, just in response to something Sasha has said, we're also seeing Russia become much, much more active commercially in Central Asia in ways that we hadn't seen before. And I talked to colleagues who say, we've never seen Russia as active in the region as we have over the past year or two. So that's a huge change. And that leads me to question, how long or how sustainable this sort of détente between, or partnership, I don't know what we're going to call it, between Russia and China in Central Asia is. But I think there's real dangers of Russia becoming too involved in Ukraine. There was so much these countries can tolerate, but it really sets a bad example for these other countries in the former Soviet space that are very, very worried about their sovereignty.
It's a very interesting point. And we've been focusing, of course, on the US reaction to this. We've been focused, on the European reaction to this, but the regional reaction, in particular in Central Asia, very, very important dynamic. And I appreciate you raising that. Dr. Guan, let me turn to you. Please give us a sense, if you could, how these troop buildups along the border with Ukraine are viewed in China, and how does this impact the China-Russia relationship? How do you expect the Chinese government to respond? And if there is an invasion, a Russian invasion into Ukraine, would China support Russia? Would it remain quiet? Would Chinese leaders prefer to distance themselves from a crisis like that in Eastern Europe? What would China's position be, and why is that?
Ukraine for China is too far. So it is generally a headache for Russia, European Union, and the United States. China, in this regard, keep quiet, but mostly we are standing closer to the Russia position because we know the source of the tension. Russia may do another choice if NATO and United States should not make the pressure towards Russia in this region so hardly. So we understand the logic. First step is Western partners unfriendly step, and then Russia answer more assertively. So in this regard, we cannot say very clearly in this issue which one more responsible. So we keep quiet. But we understand the Russian feelings because almost the same thing if you talk about the tension between China and the neighboring country in the Asia-Pacific region, almost the same thing. I mean, United States could not take the middle position, almost very clear the position against China and closer to other party when China have the deal in the region. Secondly, I want to say about the summit between Vladimir Putin and Biden. In this mean, I am always optimistic because our world, our globe already is so terrible. So between China and the United States, we should talk about the global economic development. If we are fighting against each other, we cannot have any good end. Also, for the stability and the security for the whole world, Russia and the United States, you should talk to each other more constructively, more productively. It's not only the thing for your both country, it's for whole world. So I am happy to see when he and Biden they are having a virtual meeting between Vladimir Putin and Biden the same. Even we have not a very clear consequence today, but the fact of meeting very important.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guan. So Ukraine's a long way away. China will likely remain quiet, which sounds neutral, but then I think after that, I think I heard you express a much more sympathetic view to Russia, indicating that normally these things, the logic behind these things is that usually the Western partners taking some unfriendly step of which Russia then has to respond to in an assertive way. And let me move to, I mean, are we moving over time here to some sort of a Sino-Russia military alliance or security alliance? Do you see that in the future between Russia and China? I mean, many analysts think that, you know, despite the growing cooperation between Russia and China, that neither countries are willing or find it necessary to elevate the relationship to a more formal military alliance. But others argue that an explicit anti-Western bloc seems to be developing here. And Dr. Guan, let me start with you. How do you think China sees the benefits that it would derive with greater security cooperation, including ultimately some sort of security or military alliance with Russia? Is that something that's in China's benefit?
Of course, because China today has the only great power partner in the military interaction, including the common joint military exercise. It's so important for Chinese security. But we should say completely different thing, military interaction, cooperation, and the military alliance. For both China and Russia, it's not a good option if we have a military alliance, because for Russia, very serious concern the security on the western border. But for China, we have very serious problem in the Asia-Pacific region. So if we have military alliance, if it means any part, we should have conflict or war, we have to join the unhappy process. So we are avoiding to have that picture.
Thank you very much. Jennifer, what are your perspectives on this question?
I think that there's a pragmatic relationship right now, but I think that these are two large players who have very different interests. And, this is where we could take things back to India and Pakistan, right? So, I mean, something I introduced earlier is that if you look historically, that Russia has very strong relationships with India. China, obviously has this important partnership with Pakistan. And if we can see strong mutual interests, for example, in Central Asia and Afghanistan right now, but in the long term, figuring out that kind of, making an alliance when you have such fissures and differences on those kind of strategic issues, I think makes this very, very difficult because they both, aspire to be global powers, not just regional powers. And when you both aspire to be global, then this kind of alliance, I think there's going to be inherent friction in it.
Thank you. Sasha, you wrote a piece a couple years ago titled, "Is Putin Really Considering a Military Alliance with China?" And you argued that Russia leverages the prospect of a China-Russian alliance to provoke alarmism in the US and in the EU so that the US and the EU might soften their stance toward Russia. Do you still see this in similar way 2 years on from writing that op-ed? Do you think President Putin sees other benefits potentially to a China-Russia security partnership, maybe on its own terms, not vis-a-vis the US and Europe?
I think that there are definite benefits for deepening security ties, and what the relationship in military terms actually is now is a non-aggression pact with a very strong strategic cooperation component. But I agree with Guihai and with Jen that both countries are religious about their strategic autonomy. They are powerful enough to address their immediate security concerns on their own. If China wants to do something in South China Sea, it's on its own, and arguably it has or will have the capabilities to do everything that it wants to do towards the end of this decade. Same for Russia. It doesn't need Chinese troops to do whatever Russia wants in Ukraine. And here we have divergent security priorities. Why would China be in conflict with NATO over Ukraine? Why would Russia be in additional conflict with the US over whatever might happen in South China Sea or Taiwan towards the end of this decade? So there is no need to do that. But again, teasing this idea out helps Russia to probably get some concessions or some voices in the European Union in particular, like President Macron, who would say, oh, let's bring Russia from the cold, let's engage and bring it back to the family because Russia doesn't want to become slave of China. I think that Team Biden has a very different and quite educated view. They say that it's impossible to bring Russia into the China skeptics camp because turning its back on China is a strategic suicide to Russia. Like Russia cannot afford adversarial relationship with China because China will be there on our border forever. And if, for example, tomorrow Alexei Navalny is Russia's president, and if he's well advised, I think that a lot of elements of Putin's China policy will still be intact because that's a pragmatic necessary. Going deeper is a different issue. And unfortunately, I think that Vladimir Putin might be tempted to go deeper because he sees some immediate benefits, and this security link undermines the US posture and US alliances. Problem is that some people might still view Russia and China, like if you are a Pentagon force planner, you say, okay, they're not formal allies, but let's think of them as if they are allies. And when we talk about nuclear security, right, if we talk strategic weapons and stuff, and particularly since China is not part of any treaties, let's assume that we need a strategic deterrent to counter them both at the same time. That would be strategic miscalculation for Russia because that's a step into a very dangerous and very expensive arms race.
Very helpful, Sasha. Thank you for that. We've got about 5 minutes left. I'm looking through a lot of the questions here, and several of the questions, several of the listeners are focused on this analogy, this potential analogy between Ukraine for Russia and, of course, Taiwan for China. Is there some form, the listeners want to know, is there some potential for coordination between the two sides? Would Russia support a military operation in Taiwan if China sort of, allowed for, without any opposition, an invasion into Ukraine? Others want to know how China views the Ukraine issue and whether the success or failure of US deterrence with regard to Ukraine could shape Chinese perceptions of a window of strategic opportunity with Taiwan. So a lot of questions on the connection between China's Taiwan issue and Russia's Ukraine issue. And I want to ask each of you about that. I also would like each of you to make a comment on something that we didn't talk about, not related to these questions that I just asked, that you think we should make sure that our listeners know and understand that we didn't get a chance to talk about in this hour. And I will turn first to Dr. Guan, if I could, first on this question of the connection between Ukraine and Taiwan. Do you see any?
First of all, I disagree with the formula. Ukraine and Taiwan, completely different question. Even so important, both for Russia and for China, but the character of the issue completely different. So we cannot compare. First, second one, strategically, China and Russia may do some coordination if against their willing, Western country make the provocation both in Ukraine and Taiwan. We have to give the answer or back action. We can do some coordination, but it's not in military alliance mean, only coordination. But how we should do the coordination, I don't know. But as mentioned before, Russia has enough potential to keep their own interest in the Ukraine issue. I think basically China also have confidence to resolve the Taiwan question if we see a master to do that. Not important Russia join us or not, because it's for Chinese nation is the only big issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer, over to you.
So I think it's really important to look at these individually rather than together. I think we make a big mistake, and we just saw this in Afghanistan, right? Especially when looking at the United States, we have to take the Ukraine issue on its own terms. We have to take the Taiwan issue on its own terms, and for how China perceives, for example, the threat of the United States when it's looking at Afghanistan versus how it perceives that threat when it's looking at Taiwan are two very different things. And I don't think China has any need to negotiate or have a secret deal with Russia with regards to Ukraine. These two issues are not related. And I think it's a mistake to look at them. I think we really need to take, look at these regions and these sub-regions very specifically. In terms of things that we haven't discussed, we've looked at these adversarial relations, but I do think that it would make sense for us to focus on these issues where China, Russia, and potentially the US really have shared mutual interests. And I'm hoping that what we're seeing in Central Asia, Central Eurasia, can be a point where we find these mutual interests. And another thing is that US credibility. We haven't talked a lot about that during the course of this discussion. I think it's a big question, US credibility, especially over Afghanistan, after Hong Kong, after so many of these events that we've seen regionally. I think there's big questions about what the US is. We're talking a lot about democracy summits and things like that I don't really think advance US foreign policy interests in very significant ways. So that's something I'd really like us to think more about when we talk about these relationships.
Thank you very much. Sasha, you have the last word.
I agree that the two issues are not interrelated, and it's hard for me to imagine a coordination. Although if China would do something today when Russian troops are massed on Ukrainian border, that would be a huge problem for the Pentagon and the White House. And it might happen accidentally because somebody senses an opportunity, but I don't see the opportunity for now for more coordinated policy on this too. I totally agree with Jen that we really need to talk through some issues where the interests coincide. I would add the strategic stability dimension. We are blessed to have Zhao Tun as a colleague who speaks and writes about it. I recently hosted him and my former colleague at Kommersant, Yelena Chernenko, for Moscow Carnegie Center podcast to talk about those dynamics. And it's a fascinating and really very depressing conversation that I think that we need to have more. I would add one more item, and that's cooperation between Russia and China on civilian technology that has strategic implications. For example, 5G. We have really fascinating pieces as part of Pax Sinica project that I'm leading forthcoming this month, looking into Huawei's position in competing for Russian 5G market. And it's very interesting and non-linear. Before jumping in this research with my colleagues, I had very different assumptions. And I think that the assumption was that, because of the sanctions and conflict, Huawei is now taking over all of the Russian 5G, when in fact it's not, and why you will read in the report.
Jennifer Murtazashvili, Alexander Gabuev, and Dr. Guan Guihai, thank you very much. It's been a terrific discussion. That hour went by extremely fast. I want to thank all of you for joining. Thank the audience for tuning in. As a reminder to the audience, we'll post this discussion online as an episode on our China in the World podcast. Thank you for joining us today. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.